In 1930, San Francisco did not collapse overnight. It held its posture. The fog still rolled through the Golden Gate. Cable cars still climbed Nob Hill. Ships still crowded the waterfront. But beneath the familiar rhythm, something had shifted. Banks were cautious. Dockworkers whispered about layoffs. Store windows glowed, but fewer people stepped inside. The city looked the same. It did not feel the same. And in that quiet tension, San Francisco revealed who it truly was. In 1930, San Francisco stood at the edge of the Pacific with the confidence of a city that had rebuilt itself before. Only 24 years earlier, the earthquake and fire of 1906 had nearly erased it. Yet by the end of the 1920s, the skyline had returned. The downtown streets were orderly and the port hummed with trade. The city believed in its resilience because it had evidence of it in stone and steel. The year began without panic. The stock market crash of October 1929 had shaken New York, but San Francisco felt it at a distance at first. This was not a city of Wall Street speculators. It was a port city, a banking center for the West, a gateway to Asia and the Pacific. Commerce here depended on ships, agriculture, mining, and regional industry more than on speculative finance. That distance created a brief illusion of insulation. The mornings often began in fog. It rolled in through the Golden Gate and softened the outlines of the hills. Cable cars moved deliberately along California Street and Powell Street, their operators focused and practiced. Office workers stepped off streetcars with newspapers folded under their arms, reading about national economic uncertainty while maintaining the steady pace of their routines. The physical city looked intact. Buildings along Market Street were solid and recently modernized. Department stores opened their doors at predictable hours. Street sweepers cleared the gutters. The order was visible. The waterfront remained the city's muscular core. Along the Embarcadero, longshoremen unloaded cargo from freighters that had crossed the Pacific. Crates of manufactured goods arrived from Asia. Agricultural exports from California's Central Valley were prepared for shipment abroad. The docks were loud, physical places. Men competed for daily hiring. Work was not guaranteed. By early 1930, the competition grew sharper. Fewer ships meant fewer shifts. Conversations grew shorter and more guarded. Banks in San Francisco held a reputation for caution. The city's financial institutions had learned from earlier panics. Branches of large regional banks served not only urban clients, but also farmers and small businesses across Northern California. When agricultural prices began to fall, pressure moved quietly through the banking system. Loans became harder to obtain. Credit tightened gradually rather than catastrophically. This slow constriction created unease rather than shock. Residential neighborhoods told different stories depending on elevation and income. On Nob Hill, large homes still hosted dinners and social gatherings. Wealth accumulated from railroads, shipping, and banking did not vanish overnight. Automobiles waited in driveways. Servants still reported for work, but even here conversations changed tone. Investments were discussed with caution. Charitable giving became more calculated. In the Mission District, working-class families measured the downturn in weekly wages. Small shops operated on thin margins. Grocers extended credit to trusted customers. Rent payments were sometimes late, but landlords often preferred negotiation over eviction in the early months. The city's social fabric relied on these quiet accommodations. Pride prevented open acknowledgement of hardship. People adjusted privately. Chinatown functioned with its own rhythms and internal networks. Family associations and merchant groups provided support where formal institutions did not. Businesses along Grant Avenue sold goods to tourists and residents alike. Tourism had not yet collapsed, though visitors were more restrained in spending. Community solidarity became a buffer against external instability. The architecture, dense and distinct, reinforced a sense of collective endurance. Public transportation connected these varied districts with reliability. Streetcars crossed the city's hills with mechanical consistency. Ferries moved passengers across the bay to Oakland and Berkeley, carrying office workers, students, and laborers. The ferry terminals were transitional spaces where economic news traveled quickly. A rumor about layoffs in one sector could move across the water by evening. Civic leadership projected steadiness. Municipal services continued. Police patrolled familiar routes. Fire stations remained alert. The memory of 1906 was institutionalized as preparedness. There was a belief that crisis, if it came, could be managed. This confidence was not entirely misplaced, but it underestimated the scale of the national contraction beginning to unfold. By mid-1930, signs of strain were clearer. Retail sales declined. Department store windows remained elaborate, but fewer purchases crossed the counters. Clerks noticed the difference before executives did. Restaurants saw smaller crowds at lunchtime. Theaters still showed films, offering distraction in darkened rooms, but attendance softened. Entertainment became both an escape and an indicator. When receipts fell, managers reduced staff hours. The port felt the slowdown in measurable tonnage. International trade contracted as global demand weakened. Ships arrived less frequently. The men who relied on daily hiring at the docks waited longer. Some returned home without work. Boarding houses near the waterfront saw tenants come and go unpredictably. The rhythm of wage labor lost its reliability. Agriculture, deeply connected to San Francisco's economy, struggled with falling prices. Farmers in the Central Valley shipped produce through the city, but profits shrank. When farmers could not repay loans, banks in San Francisco felt the consequences. This interconnectedness meant that even residents who never saw a farm experienced the downturn indirectly. Economic geography became visible through financial strain. Housing construction slowed. Permits declined. Skilled tradesmen who had relied on steady building projects found fewer opportunities. Carpenters, electricians, and plumbers competed for limited contracts. Some left the city seeking work elsewhere in California. Others stayed, hoping conditions would stabilize. The city did not yet show mass unemployment in the dramatic form later associated with the Depression, but underemployment spread quietly. Social hierarchies remained intact but more fragile. Charity organizations prepared for increased demand. Churches expanded food assistance programs. Mutual aid societies became more active. The response was local and incremental. There was no sweeping federal intervention yet. Communities relied on established networks. San Francisco's geography reinforced psychological separation. The city's hills created neighborhoods that felt self-contained. A downturn in one district did not immediately transform another. This physical segmentation slowed the perception of crisis. People saw their immediate surroundings and judged conditions accordingly. The overall picture emerged gradually. The press reported national bank failures and industrial decline in other regions. Comparisons were common. San Franciscans measured their condition against cities in the Midwest and East. So far, they believed themselves somewhat fortunate. The port still functioned. The banks still operated. The streets were orderly. This comparative optimism delayed collective alarm. Yet by the end of 1930, the optimism had thinned. Unemployment numbers rose. Relief applications increased. Lines outside charitable kitchens grew longer. The city had not collapsed, but the margin of security had narrowed. People felt it in subtle adjustments. Fewer purchases, postponed plans, guarded conversations. San Francisco in 1930 was not defined by spectacle. It was defined by transition. The city moved from confidence to caution in measured steps. The architecture stood firm. The fog still came and went. But beneath the physical continuity, the economic foundation shifted. The year closed with uncertainty rather than panic, and that uncertainty would shape what followed. As 1930 progressed into its later months, the mood in San Francisco settled into something heavier. It was not chaos, it was endurance under pressure. The city's earlier belief in regional insulation began to erode as national trends intensified. Bank failures elsewhere created fear that traveled faster than ships or trains. Depositors paid closer attention to headlines. Conversations inside bank lobbies were quieter. The unemployment problem became more visible. Men gathered at hiring points earlier in the morning. Some carried tools, hoping to signal readiness for any task. Others simply waited. Pride kept many from seeking public relief immediately, but the need became harder to deny. Boarding houses saw residents leave abruptly when they could no longer pay. Personal possessions were sold discreetly. Municipal government faced budget constraints. Tax revenues declined as business activity slowed. Maintaining public services required careful allocation. Officials balanced fiscal caution with social responsibility. The memory of 1906 still informed policy decisions. Preparedness meant avoiding panic, but the economic crisis was not a fire that could be extinguished quickly. In wealthier districts, visible hardship remained limited, yet investment portfolios shrank. Dividends decreased. Philanthropic institutions received fewer donations precisely when demand for aid increased. This imbalance strained established charitable systems. Private benevolence, once sufficient for localized poverty, struggled to address expanding unemployment. The port's activity continued to decline in correlation with global trade contraction. Shipping lines adjusted schedules. Warehouse space went unused. The physical infrastructure remained impressive, but its utilization dropped. The waterfront's noise softened. For a city whose identity was tied to maritime commerce, this quiet carried symbolic weight. Cultural life persisted, though in altered form. Theaters and music venues adapted pricing or offered promotions to maintain attendance. Cinema became particularly significant. For a small fee, individuals could sit in warmth and darkness, temporarily detached from economic anxiety. The entertainment industry provided not only diversion, but also limited employment, though not enough to offset broader losses. Educational institutions across the Bay and Berkeley, and within the city, continued operating. Students discussed economic theory and policy responses, aware that they were living within a historic contraction. Intellectual analysis did not translate into immediate relief, but it shaped the discourse. Ideas about government intervention and financial reform gained attention. San Francisco's Asian trade connections weakened as international markets struggled. Merchants who specialized in import-export operations faced declining volumes. Some diversified into domestic trade, others reduced staff. The global nature of the downturn made local solutions insufficient. The Pacific, once a conduit of opportunity, transmitted economic distress. Working-class neighborhoods bore cumulative strain. Extended families shared housing to reduce expenses. Informal labor arrangements emerged. Women sought additional domestic work when available. Children became aware of financial tension even if shielded from details. Consumption patterns shifted toward necessity. Luxuries were deferred indefinitely. Public demonstrations were limited in 1930 compared to later years, but dissatisfaction simmered. Labor organizations monitored conditions closely. The memory of earlier labor conflicts in the city's history remained present. While large-scale strikes had not yet defined the year, the structural conditions for unrest were forming as unemployment persisted. Weather patterns continued indifferent to economic change. The fog arrived and receded. Sunlight illuminated the bay with the same clarity as in more prosperous years. This environmental continuity contrasted with financial instability. It emphasized that the crisis was man-made, rooted in markets and credit rather than in natural disaster. San Francisco's identity as a rebuilt city influenced its psychology. Residents often referenced the earthquake era as proof of endurance, yet the comparison had limits. The earthquake had been sudden and visible. The depression was gradual and abstract. There was no single moment of destruction, no clear endpoint for reconstruction. The challenge was sustained contraction without dramatic rupture. By the close of 1930, relief organizations reported higher demand than at any point earlier in the year. Soup kitchens served more meals. Churches organized clothing drives. Civic leaders debated appropriate responses within constrained budgets. The absence of large-scale federal programs left cities largely responsible for their own mitigation efforts. Business failures increased incrementally. Small enterprises closed quietly. Storefronts on secondary streets displayed vacancy signs. Prime commercial corridors remained active but thinner in traffic. The visual markers of decline accumulated slowly. Residents noticed familiar shops disappearing. The changes were personal rather than statistical. Transportation systems continued to function, though ridership patterns shifted. Commuter flows adjusted as employment locations changed. Ferries still crossed the bay, but some passengers traveled not to offices but in search of work. Movement itself became a strategy for survival. The year did not end with resolution. There was no decisive recovery in December 1930. Instead, San Francisco entered the new year with diminished confidence. The structures of the city remained. The institutions endured. But the margin for error had narrowed considerably. San Francisco in 1930 was a city in measured descent rather than dramatic collapse. It preserved order, maintained civic routines, and relied on established networks of commerce and charity. Yet beneath that stability, economic contraction tightened its hold. The fog that rolled through the Golden Gate seemed symbolic by year's end, not as a sign of mystery, but as a reminder of limited visibility. The future was obscured. The city continued forward, disciplined and restrained, unaware of how much more severe the coming years would become.